This is part 3 of a course in Key Principles of Brain Health and how to optimize brain functioning as a means of addressing problems such as anxiety or fatigue, insomnia or brain fog. We're using the framework of functional medicine, which uses functional laboratory testing to look for underlying biological imbalances and weak points, and then develops personalized plans for addressing those causal factors. In Unit 3, we're going to look at blood sugar regulation. I want to show how problems in blood sugar regulation could lead to things like fatigue and mood swings. And in fact, it's really one of the most common forms of dysregulation that causes this kind of problem. So one of the first places for a practitioner to look. A quick recap. The functional medicine model is based on an analysis at 3 levels. Firstly, symptoms, things like anxiety and poor concentration or craving or weight gain. And then we use lab tests to ask questions about how well body systems are functioning or which systems are not functioning optimally, and so find out where we can make the most difference. And then we've got triggers and primary causes, which may be the best place to target interventions. These are the main body systems relevant to the sort of everyday problems with brain performance that we're interested in. And we need to consider that the brain is often impacted from elsewhere. And in this unit we're looking at hormones, and in particular hormones involved in regulating blood sugar. Hormones are signalling molecules secreted into the blood and then picked up around the body. In the last unit we saw how all brain function ultimately depends on cellular energy production, or the controlled burning of fuel from food in the presence of oxygen and releasing energy which is then captured as the molecule ATP. The main fuel for the brain is glucose. It's a simple sugar and it comes from carbohydrate in the diet and is delivered to cells via the bloodstream. Now, because ATP only lasts in the cells for a matter of seconds after it's created, we need to have a stable and reliable blood supply of glucose in order to maintain the functioning. So the job of regulation is to take a very intermittent intake of fuel or sugar into the body, when we eat that is, and turn it into a smooth and stable blood glucose level. So that's quite a challenge actually. And when it goes wrong, we get symptoms like energy swings or mood instability or even brain fog. Let's take a closer look at where glucose comes from. So as I've said, glucose is a simple sugar or a monosaccharide, chemically speaking. It's made of carbon, oxygen and hydrogen atoms, and it has a ring structure. Glucose in its simple form is actually relatively rare in food, but we do actually derive quite a lot of glucose from other sources. So table sugar is one. It's got the name sucrose, chemically speaking, and it's a disaccharide, meaning that it consists of 2 simple sugars bonded together chemically, in this case 1 glucose and 1 fructose. Fructose, by the way, is also an energy source, but it can't be used directly by cells, or at least most cells, and it has to be processed by the liver. Now, carbohydrate is actually a general term that includes these other sugars, but most carbohydrates are found in the form of polysaccharides, which are long chains of sugar molecules joined end to end. Polysaccharides are also called complex carbohydrates. Let's take a look at what happens when you eat carbohydrates. The complex carbs are broken down into simple sugars by digestion, which are then absorbed into the blood through the lining of the gut. And the process is shown in this graph. So I'm assuming we're eating at this point in time, so time is shown horizontally in the graph, and the blood glucose starts off pretty low, assuming that we haven't eaten for perhaps a few hours, and gradually begins to rise, and then levels off after maybe a few hours, before gradually falling back again. That's assuming that we don't eat anymore in the meantime. Now, these 2 dotted lines here are reflecting the idea that there are bounds on blood sugar or healthy limits. And if the blood glucose crosses those limits, if it goes too high or too low, then problems can follow. Too high is a problem because sugar can actually react chemically with other molecules, rendering them useless or functionally useless. So it's a form of molecular damage, and it's called glycation. So for example, in the blood, sugar can react with hemoglobin, which is the protein that carries oxygen. And the result is hemoglobin that just doesn't work and it can't do its job anymore. Now, besides proteins, sugar can also react with fats and even DNA. So clearly you want to limit the amount of glycation going on. Now, too low a level of blood glucose, and you've got the obvious problem of a deficient fuel supply to the cells and therefore low energy production, leaving you probably with fatigue or brain fog and maybe anxiety or even sleep problems. But in this graph, everything's looking healthy and working well, and the blood glucose remains within the bounds. It's not too high, not too low, and there are no problems. Now, the key thing in regulation is how fast simple sugars enter the bloodstream from the gut. So let's look at what happens when you eat something containing a lot of refined sugars. And that's shown as the red graph here. So this time sugar is rapidly absorbed from the gut, and the glucose level rises rapidly and peaking too high. So at this point the body has to respond to that and bring the blood sugar down, and that's the job of the hormone insulin. So a lot of insulin is secreted, and the result is that the blood glucose starts to drop again quite rapidly. And the trouble is that when you've got a high spike like this, it's easy to overshoot and the blood glucose drops too low. And that can leave you feeling tired and hungry and maybe craving for sugary foods again. It's a state called reactive hypoglycemia. So insulin is really a key player. And its job is it tells the cells to open their doors to glucose and take on sugar, take on glucose. And that will cause the blood level to come down. And the glucose is either put into storage or it's used directly for energy. Now, insulin only regulates the sugar glucose. The other sugars, such as fructose, and which, remember, can't be used by cells for fuel anyway, or at least by brain cells, those other sugars aren't regulated. Fructose is not regulated. But that doesn't mean that they don't matter, because they're still capable of causing glycation and the damage associated with glycation. And in fact, it turns out that fructose causes even more glycation. So we really need to regulate fructose ourselves by taking care of it within our diet. What happens when blood sugar regulation isn't working well? You can develop a condition called insulin resistance, which is where the cells stop responding to insulin. So the insulin is there, but it's not having an effect, or at least it's having a weaker effect. And the result is that blood glucose tends to start drifting high, or at least it takes longer to bring it down. And at the same time, the cell's uptake of glucose is lower, and you can end up with fatigue and mood swings. Insulin resistance develops over a long period of time, perhaps even decades. And if it gets bad enough, you can have diabetes. So the thing about diabetes, at least as a diagnosis, is that it's only a fairly arbitrary point on a spectrum of dysregulation or poor functioning. So we're back to that point that we had in the introduction to the course about that there's a big grey region between optimal health on the one hand and outright disease on the other. And insulin resistance, or pre-diabetes as it's sometimes called, is right in that region. It's also called metabolic syndrome or syndrome X, and particularly so when it's linked to overweight, as it very often is. And in fact, insulin resistance is so tied up with being overweight that Dr. Mark Hyman, who's one of the leading figures in functional medicine, has coined the term diabesity to describe it. So what causes insulin resistance? Well, firstly, it seems to be the result of lots of peaks and troughs in blood sugar happening repeatedly over time, and that puts a strain on the regulatory system, and the resulting glycation damage may be part of the causal story as well. Inflammation, and especially chronic inflammation, blunts the insulin response, and we'll cover inflammation in more detail in the later part of the course. Being overweight is both a cause and an effect of insulin resistance. And in fact, fat, and especially abdominal fat, is a source of inflammation. So these roots are interconnected. Also sedentary lifestyle, toxicity, and stress in the form of high cortisol. Cortisol is a hormone. We'll say more about it in the next part of the course. And insulin problems and diabetes do run in families, so there can be a genetic predisposition. But remember, genes are only blueprints, and they are switchable. And it's nutritional and lifestyle factors that are the key in gene expression. So having the gene certainly doesn't seal your fate, as it were, and in past centuries, diabetes was very rare, even though people actually had the same genes as we do today. Let's take a closer look at the effects of sugar in the brain. So we've seen that high levels of sugar in the blood are a problem because it causes glycation, which is damaging at the molecular level. But glycation doesn't just happen in the blood, it happens anywhere where glucose concentration is high enough, including in the tissues, inside cells, and at the membranes of cells. And the brain is particularly vulnerable to glycation, partly because it's made up of quite a lot of fat, which is vulnerable to glycation and can be damaged in that way. So when a molecule has become glycated, it's not just that it's functionally useless, but it actually becomes a source of free radicals. We met free radicals back in Unit 2. They are highly reactive molecules produced as a kind of exhaust fume from the cellular energy production, and they need to be mopped up by the body's antioxidant defenses. So a lot of glycation can lead to oxidative stress, which is where the antioxidant defenses are put under strain by the excess of free radicals being produced. So in short, a diet high in sugars and refined carbs, causing spikes and troughs in blood sugar and eventually insulin resistance, can build up over time and do a lot of damage in the brain that slowly degrades performance. There's some evidence that insulin resistance in the brain is a significant mechanism leading to the development of Alzheimer's. It's actually been discovered that the brain produces its own insulin, and in the research community people have started referring to Alzheimer's as diabetes type 3. So like diabetes, Alzheimer's as a diagnosis is really just a point on a spectrum of dysregulation and loss of performance. It's not just something that arrives in old age, but it's a process that can start much earlier. Another effect of sugar is that it hits the brain like a drug, meaning that very quickly you can get a good feeling or a wave of pleasure, and also relatively quickly you can get a feeling of wanting more of that. Trouble is, more isn't necessarily satisfying. And the mechanism behind that experience is quite well understood. Sugar affects the brain's dopamine system. Dopamine's a neurotransmitter, and it's key in the brain's reward and motivation system. And many addictive drugs, such as cocaine, are known to affect the dopamine system, and habitual use of drugs can lead to a kind of dysregulation of dopamine. Let's return to the blood sugar dip that follows a spike. Hypoglycemia is the name for this state of low blood sugar, and as we've seen, it starves the cells of the fuel for energy and can leave you feeling tired, hungry, maybe anxious, maybe even a little shaky. And you can often feel better by eating more sugar or carbohydrate. Actually, there's evidence that the blood sugar doesn't need to even drop that low to create the experience. It just needs to be falling, and that it's actually the brain that sort of creates the feeling of fatigue as a means of conserving resources. So we're at this point of low blood sugar and we need to raise blood sugar again. And to do that you need to either consume some more carbs or you need to mobilize your stores. And mobilizing stores is another important side of blood sugar regulation. And practically speaking, the main hormone that's involved is cortisol, which I mentioned earlier. Cortisol is a stress hormone produced by the adrenal glands, and it also can become dysregulated, as we'll see in the next unit. But for now, let's just say that if you struggle to produce cortisol, then you're going to be more prone to these hypoglycemic states, and you'll struggle to get out of them. How do you test your body's ability to regulate blood glucose? Well, the first test is hemoglobin A1C. I mentioned earlier that hemoglobin can get damaged by glycation or by excessively high glucose levels in the blood. And hemoglobin A1C is simply a glycated hemoglobin. So it's left non-functional and it needs to be cleared out of the system, but it tends to stay around for maybe a few weeks before being processed. And that means that looking at the level of hemoglobin A1C in the blood gives you an indication of your proneness to these blood sugar spikes, perhaps averaged over this period of a few weeks. Fasting insulin in the blood is another useful test. If you're insulin resistant, the body needs to produce more insulin to get the job done for lowering blood sugar. And so a high fasting insulin level indicates insulin resistance. And there's a test you can do at home. You can invest in a blood glucose monitor. And these are machines that are available very cheaply from high street chemists as well as online. And you can check your blood glucose levels pretty instantly based on a finger prick. Now, usually the best time to measure is when you haven't eaten for a while, so you're testing your fasting levels. So usually the first thing on the morning. And high glucose at that time suggests insulin resistance. But you can also measure at any time you want. So for example, when you're in the midst of an energy crash or a mood swing. And you can even do a challenge test, which is where you consume some glucose and then you see how high and how fast glucose rises in the blood and then how long it takes to come back down again. We'll cover tests for cortisol regulation in the next unit of the course, so I'm not going to say anything more about that here. Now, if you find that you're insulin resistant, there's a lot that you can do to begin reversing it. Most important things are related to lifestyle. So you can reduce the amount of carbohydrates or the relative amount of carbohydrate in your diet. And especially foods that create these spikes in blood sugar. So focus on low GL foods. GL means glycemic load, and it's a measure of how much and how fast sugar enters the blood when you eat it. Exercise is also key, and especially a form known as high intensity interval training, which has been shown by research to boost the sensitivity to insulin. But a word of warning here as well. Now, if you have adrenal dysregulation as well as insulin problems, then you've got to be careful with these strategies because they might end up doing you more harm than good. So again, it's best to do a broad range of functional testing so that you get the whole picture of what's going on. Lastly, there are specific nutrients that are known to boost insulin sensitivity when you supplement them. We'll finish by summarizing what we've covered in this presentation. A stable and consistent supply of glucose to brain cells is critical to brain function. So that means that the body's ability to regulate blood glucose, meaning to adjust it up and down as needed, is key to brain health. And dysregulation or loss of stability can lead to unstable energy and motivation, mood swings, anxiety and brain fog. And in fact, blood sugar dysregulation is perhaps the most common causal factor behind these low-level brain problems like fatigue and mood problems. The two main forms of dysregulation are firstly insulin resistance, which can lead to excessive spikes of blood sugar and resulting damage, and at the same time low glucose uptake and resulting fatigue, and in time increased risk of diabetes and Alzheimer's. And secondly, adrenal dysregulation, which can leave you prone to hypoglycemic lows because you may not be able to produce the cortisol that's needed to boost blood sugar back up again. We'll take a more extended look at cortisol in the next unit covering the stress response.